Thank you. All right, guys. So, we're done reviewing perfect competition. We can go straight to monopoly. You may remember it was a couple classes ago that we introduced monopoly. How does monopoly differ from perfect competition?
They don't have to be efficient or maximum.
Nothing really pushes them to be efficient, absolutely. And in terms of analysis, I mean, how did we arrive at that result? By simply analyzing the profit maximizing behavior of a monopoly, right? Bless you. We know that the monopoly chooses to produce monopoly quantity, right? Monopoly output, at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? And we analyzed the behavior of a monopoly in a graph, where monopoly is the only firm serving the entire industry, correct? And so we've seen that if this is the demand in the industry or in the market the monopoly is serving, then what's the shape of the marginal revenue? Do you remember what the shape of the marginal revenue was? It looked like this, right? Marginal revenue. Started at the same intersection on the vertical axis as the demand, only has twice the slope. And of course, the structure, the cost structure of the monopoly looks just like the structure of any other firm, because it's determined by the law of diminishing marginal product. So it's the two U's that look like this: marginal cost, average total cost, right? By the way, guys, you will find these in the textbook that you have access to. So those pictures are widely available anywhere you want. So, question, based on this information, can you find the quantity that maximizes monopoly's profit? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the quantity, correct? Monopoly output. How much is this monopoly going to charge? What's going to be the monopoly price? Well, what's the limit on how much monopoly is going to charge? You're right, monopoly can charge whatever it wants. For example, when Steve Jobs brought iPad to the market, he literally could have asked what he wanted. He could have asked $200 million for an iPad. Why didn't he ask that?
The name would be zero.
Oh, nobody would buy it, right? So yes, it's true, monopoly can ask whatever it wants to. The question is, what price does the monopoly actually want to ask? The price at which the monopoly sells the quantity that does what? Maximizes the profit, right? And so that's the whole idea. In other words, the monopoly chooses a combination of quantity and price at which that monopoly profit is maximized. So the question is, if you're going to produce this quantity, what's the highest price you would actually get away with? That's the price, right? That's the monopoly price. Why? Because at that price, you have enough consumers willing and able to buy this product so that you actually sell monopoly out. That makes sense? That's the whole idea. So if you sell QM units at the price PM, how much profit does the monopoly generate? Well, if this is the price at which you're selling, this is average cost, average total cost at which you're producing, then this is the profit. That makes sense? That's the monopoly profit. So once again, you use the profit maximization condition, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, to find the quantity. Once you see the quantity, you find the corresponding price, and you find the monopoly profit. And that's basically what the last homework is about, right? Now, the monopolist is not producing efficiently, correct? What's inefficient about the monopoly's output, about the monopoly's production? You mentioned that it's not pushed to efficiency. How can you tell?
It's not at the lowest point on the average total cost curve.
Because monopoly is producing quantity at which it's not producing at the lowest average cost. There is a way to produce at the lower average cost, right? And the monopoly does not do that. Of course, if this was not a monopoly, if it was a perfectly competitive firm, there would be more firms entering the industry. Eventually, competition would prevail, right? Now, how can a monopoly remain a monopoly? I mean, look, when Steve Jobs invented and brought to the market the iPad, for a certain period of time, Apple was a monopoly in the market for tablets, right? But it didn't last forever. How come?
Other companies made their own tablet.
Because other companies were lured by that positive economic profit, so they invented their own products and started competing against iPad, right? So that's exactly what happened. Does it happen to every monopoly? Every monopoly that's generating positive economic profit will end up one day facing competition.
The generates positive.
Every monopoly that generates positive economic profit will one day face stiff competition. Not too far from now.
Medicine?
What about medicine? What do you think?
I'm trying to think of a word like they trade.
Patent, right? In other words, if a monopoly or if a firm manages to, for example, patent its product, then it's guaranteed to be the only firm in the market, right? It's a guaranteed monopoly position. Absolutely. What's the lifetime of a patent if you keep extending it every so many years? Something like 17 years or 21 years, something like pretty much 2 decades you can be guaranteed to be a monopoly in that particular market, right? Very good. Now, let's for a while conduct a small mental exercise. Let's imagine for a moment this monopoly, for whatever reason, starts behaving competitively. What does it mean to behave competitively? Suppose this monopoly decides to try and produce quantity it would produce if it was a competitive company. It's not a competitive company because there is no competition, but if it was, well, remember, what was the profit maximization condition for a perfectly competitive for a perfectly competitive firm? Price equals marginal cost. Remember? That was profit maximization condition for a perfectly competitive firm. Question, is the monopoly producing where price equals marginal cost? This is price, this is marginal cost. They're not equal to each other at that point. Can you find quantity that would actually satisfy this competitive profit maximization condition, where marginal cost is equal to price? Well, price is determined by demand, right? This is marginal cost. So this would be the quantity we call the competitive quantity. Competitive output. An output monopoly would produce if it behaved competitively, right? What would be the price at which the monopoly would actually sell that output? It would be a competitive price. Is that what the monopoly does? No, we know that's not what the monopoly does. Why doesn't the monopoly produce competitive quantity at a competitive price?
They don't have to.
And instead they can do what?
Monopoly price.
Instead, they can cut production down to monopoly quantity in order to increase price up to monopoly price. And why would they do it? Because it increases the monopoly profit. Exactly. Okay? So this is what monopolies do. Monopolies, because they don't face competition, cut output and increase price. In other words, monopolies earn their money by working less and charging you more for less. That makes sense? Is that the American way?
Oh, yeah.
Is it? Is that how we built the greatest economy on earth? Absolutely not. Look guys, what is economy?
System,
That produces
goods and services,
goods and services out of
resources.
resources. Very good. What makes that system, what makes the economy efficient?
Using as little resources to make as many.
Using as little resources to as much goods and services, or producing as much goods and services out of the same resources. In other words, the secret to efficiency is to produce as much as possible. Is that what the monopoly does? No. The monopoly cuts output, wastes resources, and squeezes the market to charge money, so it earns the monopoly profit. Okay? So if you have markets monopolized, you have smaller amount of goods, less service, poorer service at a higher price. How do you like that? Not great, right? So that's basically what you need to know about monopoly. Let's now discuss very briefly a special case of monopolies. And I think we touched on it, but let's be more specific. Have we talked about natural monopolies? How many power companies can you choose from in Jacksonville when you sign up for power service?
Just
One,
What's the company here in Jacksonville if you have a company?
JA.
Everybody?
Oh.
Why don't you try someone else, guys?
Is there any?
Because there ain't anybody, right? So how many firms are serving Jacksonville electricity market?
one.
It's a monopoly, right? Are monopolies efficient? Definitely not. What is the best way to discipline the inefficient monopolies and force them to behave efficiently? Let the competition in, right? Let the competition in, and the competition will force them to produce efficiently. Why don't we have more than one power company in this town? Why are so many markets in America served by a single company? What could be a good reason? By the way, how many companies deliver sewer services to your residents?
It's just the
Can you
city.
pick out of various competing companies?
No, it's just by the city.
Why? Why don't we have multiple power companies? Why don't we have multiple sewer companies? Typically utilities, right? Water. How many companies deliver water to your house? Why don't we have more of them? Suppose there would be 50 water, sewer, and power companies in Jacksonville fighting for your business, just like there's pizza places, plenty of them, right? Why not?
We have a lot of infrastructure. to
Oh my
support.
gosh, can you imagine your house hooked up to 50 sewer lines? Can you imagine the street with 50 sets of wires? Aha. So why don't we do it? What would be wrong with that?
It would be inefficient.
Say it very loud.
It would be inefficient.
Absolutely. Why would that be inefficient? Is it cheap or expensive? Is it costly or cheap to build infrastructure, such as set of wires to every house and the piping for sewers and so on? It's extremely expensive, right? In other words, utilities operate with extremely expensive or extremely high sunk costs. And if you wanted to have multiple companies competing in the same market, that cost would have to be sunk over and over again, right? In other words, the cost of producing electricity, if you had 2 or 3 or 5 electricity companies, the cost would actually be higher than the cost when you have a monopoly. So this is a rare example, bless you, very rare example of an industry where monopoly actually can produce more efficiently than a perfect competition or competitive industry. That makes sense? These happen very rarely. And of course, there's a lot of experimentation going on with competition in power industry, for example, right? There's a lot of experimentation going on in various markets. I'm not sure how far we've gotten here in Florida. I know in Virginia there's still very much not the case. But there are some places in the country where they try to introduce some kind of a competition with varying degree of success. I don't know if you've heard, but there were examples of rampant abuse and misuse of the system and actually didn't really work as well as it was supposed to. In other words, these few examples of markets, so-called natural monopolies that can produce at lower cost if they're monopolies rather than competing firms, really are better serving us when there's just one set of infrastructure. But then, of course, that raises an issue. If we're better off with one JEA, then the JEA is going to behave like a monopoly, squeeze the market, overcharge us, and make positive economic profit. And prices of electricity in Jacksonville are going to be so high, most of you guys are not even going to be able to put your to turn your air conditioning off. So, what do you think we should do? If adding more firms, if opening the industry to competition is not going to help us, then what should we do?
Price ceiling?
Of some sort, right? In other words, regulation. In other words, if you have an industry that is inherently inefficient, that is the reason in America we accept as a good enough reason for the government to intervene in a private enterprise, right? Because this is a free country. You can run your business any way you want to. You can make it a success, you can run it to the ground. It's your choice. But when there is a natural monopoly, and that natural monopoly has a tendency to produce inefficiently for a very long time, then it is in public interest for the government to step in and actually regulate the natural monopoly. If you were the regulator, if you had the opportunity to go and regulate this monopoly, what quantity would you, what price and what quantity would you force the monopoly to produce?
Competitive.
You definitely could do the competitive quantity and competitive price. And the monopoly would make a little positive economic profit, right? So people working for that company would not necessarily drive Maseratis, but they would still drive pretty nice big Mercedes and BMWs. But it's still positive economic profit. Can you see a quantity that would make even more economic sense?
The lowest cost.
The lowest cost, right? Like here? That would certainly be efficient in the sense you would be producing the electricity at the lowest cost, but you would only produce this quantity. A lot of Jacksonvillians would not be able to buy, electricity or turn on their air conditioners. What would you guys say about this quantity and the corresponding price? First of all, how much profit would the monopoly make at that quantity at this price? at this quantity and at that price, what's the cost? What's the average cost of producing unit of electricity at this price and this quantity? This is the average cost, and this is the price. So price would just cover average cost, and the profit would be 0. Price would be relatively low, and a lot of Jacksonvillians would actually be served. That makes sense? In other words, it would be the lowest price at which a lot of people get served, and the firm still makes 0 economic profit. In other words, you know, they're still making a living like any other firm in Jacksonville. That makes sense? All right, guys. So these are ideas we explored. We talked about natural monopolies that must be regulated. Every industrialized nation on earth regulates its natural monopolies. If it's not a natural monopoly, then you either need to introduce competition. How can you introduce competition? What can the government do to make sure that an industry becomes more competitive? If there's too much market power, if there's just one firm, for example, monopoly.
Subsidize.
Possibly there may be even ways like that. I can imagine some subsidy perhaps might do that. Remove any barriers there might be, right? For example, if a firm is maintaining its hold on the market because it's run by thugs who are intimidating the neighborhood and chasing all the competitors away, then the government definitely needs to step in and restore law and order, right? Deal with the thugs, and so that businesses can come in and start competing. That makes sense? But then, we also have patents in this country, where government grants the company a patent, and effectively the government makes that company a monopoly and guarantees the company's monopoly position. Why would the government do it? When on one hand, the government regulates natural monopolies and breaks up the unnatural ones, right? Why would the government then protect other monopolies with patents? What's the point?
Innovation.
Bingo. That is the reason for the government to actually grant competition, grant patent, restrict competition, because it promotes innovation. In other words, if the company can prove that it uses those extraordinary profits, those large positive economic profits, in order to invest in research and development, then yes, there is a social benefit to that activity. That makes sense? Yes.
But don't they, like you said, they're able to redo their patent, but if other competitors are able to make the same product or better, when they start doing that for them? Because I doing a project looking at Johnson & Johnson, and a lot of major pharmaceutical products, they're not going to repatent because other competition is coming up with stuff that's better, but it's similar, but they can't give it to the market because of the patent one.
And so, okay, I'm not sure I'm following. And the question is whether or not that's good, or
Like, I mean, it's like Johnson & Johnson, they make a lot of stuff,
yes.
and they have other companies that's close to them,
So they have close competitors.
and
Yes.
they make similar products, but they can't
Okay.
they can't release them because of how close they are related.
What do you
Because
mean
of
they
that.
can't release them? Who can? Like Johnson & Johnson's competitors cannot release those products because they are too similar to Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah.
And
because of the
Johnson & Johnson has a patent.
But they're about to release them because they said they don't have them long enough to where they're allowed to.
Oh, there you go. In other words, are patents forever? Absolutely not. I mean, you only have a patent for so many years, and after those years run out, you lose the patent, and then the market becomes competitive, right? In other words, does anyone have a patent on aspirin? Yes or no?
You have all these
Absolutely
different
not.
kinds of people.
Say it again?
You have all these different brands, like
Exactly.
Bayers, all that other.
Well, yeah, you have the fancy, right? High priced Bayer aspirin because it's coated in something very nice and whatnot, right? But then you can buy your Equate aspirin, right? The Walmart brand, or every chain makes their own brand, and then you can just buy generic aspirin. You can go on Amazon.com and you find 20 suppliers of bags of aspirin for pennies, basically, right? So yeah, those are then pharmaceuticals, or substances that are produced in a competitive market. By the way, how does it work? Have you ever heard how it works in the pharmaceutical market? When pharmaceutical firms lose their patent, who steps in? Who actually competes? In other words, who produces those generic drugs you can now buy in Walmart for $4 a monthly dose, right? You know that Walmart is running these specials, right? $4 a monthly dose of some of those generic basic medicines for all kinds of conditions. Who produces that? Those used to be drugs produced at high price, under patent for a long period of time by some of the top pharmaceutical companies. Today, patent has expired. These substances are produced by just about anybody. Who's just about anybody? Who actually does it? Have you heard? Who are the major players in the generic pharmaceutical market? Because everybody knows the big pharmaceutical companies, right? Everybody knows Pfizer and Eli Lilly and AstraZeneca and whatnot, these ginormous pharmaceutical companies that control these patented markets. But who produces tons and tons of aspirin, tons and tons of these generics? Do you think Pfizer bothers producing tons and tons of aspirin? How much money is there to be made on aspirin, guys? Next to nothing, right? So who produces it? India is a huge producer of generic pharmaceuticals. Little country of Slovenia, in the south of Europe, in the Balkans, on the edge of Italy. Slovenia, a country of 1.5 million people. It's a pretty good economy, and a big chunk of their economy is generic pharmaceuticals. So there's these countries that, once the patents expire, they jump on it, start producing it and compete, right? And once there's competition, Indians produce 1,000 tons, Slovenians produce 500 tons, the prices collapse and you can get it for $4 a monthly dose. That makes sense? And it becomes efficient because it becomes perfect competition, basically. Very good. So, we talked about innovation as a good enough reason to grant companies the right to reap those positive economic profit, right? Innovation. Then we talked about natural monopolies, which are industries where it really doesn't help to introduce more competition, where competition actually reduces efficiency. As bizarre as it sounds, there are these rare examples. But ultimately, in most industries, in the absolute majority of industries, monopolies simply end up being inefficient, and they are either eliminated by entry of new firms attracted by positive economic profit, or if there are barriers to entry, those barriers need to be removed by the government action, right? So it's one of the roles, guys, it's one of the roles of the government in a free market economy. Because why is this important? Why is this an important point? A lot of people say, look, this is a free country, this is a free market economy, so the government must keep its hands off the economy, right? While this may sound right, it doesn't really tell the whole story. The purpose of government letting its hands off the economy is to let the free markets settle in long-run equilibrium with zero economic profit, where firms produce efficiently, right? That's what we want to accomplish. But when you have a thug terrorizing a neighborhood, setting up barriers to entry, not letting other pizza places into the neighborhood, should the government simply take its hands off the neighborhood and let the thug rule? Why not? What's your problem with thugs? They're inefficient. That's the point, right? Besides being bad people and ugly and whatever, terrorizing our children, they're inefficient. That's the biggest problem. They are inefficient. And that's why you have to have the government restoring order, right? Law and order, safe streets, enforcement of contracts, and so on and so forth. In other words, all of these things that the government provides us with together comprise what we call institutions of free market economy. Institutions of free market economy. In other words, free market economy does not create itself out of thin air simply by government stepping aside and doing nothing. Market economy ends up in that efficient long-run equilibrium only when the government does what? Creates and maintains institutions that support that free market economy. How do we know that, guys? Because we've seen how it works when this is not the case. Let's talk about two examples. First of all, let's start with communist countries such as the former Soviet Union. Former Soviet Union was our #1 geopolitical foe in the history of the United States. Nobody has ever threatened us as severely and for such a long time as the Soviet Union, entire post-World War II era. And of course, we clashed in the Cold War, right? Ultimately, we won that Cold War. In 1990, Soviet Union collapsed. What did we do to the Soviet Union that it collapsed? Did we shoot it into pieces? We were not, it was not a shooting war, it was not a hot war, it was a cold war. So what brought about the downfall of this ginormous colossus, the Soviet Union, that threatened us and our allies?
Did we outproduce them?
They ended up extremely inefficient. How come? In other words, we beat them in efficiency. Why did they end up being extremely inefficient? Because as a communist economy, it was run by the government. In other words, it's not just that the government didn't get its hands off the economy. It's that government basically held the entire economy in its hands. Okay? Meaning the government was running every company. Government was running every industry. Every bank, every restaurant, every waiter, every waitress were government employees. Okay? That's what the communist economy was. And since the communist economy was run by the government, let me just put it like this, guys. Here in America, executive power at the federal level, that's president and cabinet of secretaries, right? How many people are in the cabinet? Justice, right? Attorney General, then Department of State, Department of the Interior, bless you, and so on. There's about 11 of them, right? 11 or 12 of them. What do you think was the size of the cabinet in the Soviet Union?
Huge, probably.
Several dozen people. Why? Did they have like 5 secretaries of state or something? No. You know what they did? They had a secretary for steel production. They had a secretary for corn production. Secretary for apartment building. Why would they have these bizarre government positions?
For control.
Because the government ran these industries. So basically there was a secretary, member of the cabinet, who was responsible for running that sector of the economy. But of course, if there's one person at the top running the entire sector of civilian apartment building, then how many companies do you think are competing against each other in that country? None. The entire sector is run as a
Single person.
big monopoly. Exactly. And if you run an economy basically full of monopolies, totally monopolized economy, for 70 years, what do you end up with? total inefficiency, right? You run the economy to the ground. So that was the problem with the Soviet Union. Of course, Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1990. That government fell, and the economy was suddenly free from the shackles of that oppressive government. Suddenly, former Soviet Union, now 15 different countries, among them Russia, everybody calls it Russia, right, are suddenly developing free market economy. And you would immediately think that, wow, that's so awesome, because now that the government finally got its hands off that economy, what's going to happen? Competition takes off, efficiency sets in, and within years or a couple of decades, Russia is going to be a rich country, right? Is that what happened? Why not?
No real structure.
In other words, is that what it takes for a free market economy to be efficient, that the government simply takes its hands off the economy? Guys, if it was that simple, Somalia would be the greatest country on earth, right? Because they don't have a government. So we know, in fact, to make the market economy efficient, you have to have just the right participation by the government in economic affairs. You have to have government not over-regulating, not doing too much, not doing things it's not supposed to. But you definitely need government providing safety, security, law and order, enforcement of contracts, and so on, right? In other words, institutions of market economy. Did the new Russian government, post-communist Russian government, provide these institutions of market economy? No. It was totally incompetent government captured by thugs who took control of the economy, robbed the economy, people were poor as poor gets. A bunch of people became billionaires at the expense of everybody else, and the economy suffered inefficiency for another N years, right? And it's really only relatively recently, last several years, that the economy is slowly getting somewhat better and serving people somewhat better, because these institutions of market economy are very slowly being provided by the government. But it's a long process. So, guys, whenever I hear someone say, you know, the government needs to get its hands off the economy, I'm really being like, wow. You know, we have to make sure we know what it is we're talking about. Because this is not a question of big government, this is not a question of small government, this is a question of efficiency. That's the criterion. Okay? Thank you very much. Did it turn on?